Değerli konuklar, sevgili izleyiciler, Fikir Önderleri yayınımıza hepiniz hoş geldiniz efendim. Birkaç dakika gecikmeyle başladık. Bundan dolayı özür diliyoruz. Ama karşınızdayız bir 3 dakikalık gecikmeyle birlikte. Efendim malum bizi izleyen herkes biliyor ama ben bir kez daha söyleyeyim. Üzerinde görev bu. 3 mecrada canlı yayınlarımız gerçekleşiyor. YouTube, Instagram ve Twitter. Bunların üçünden de bizi takip edebilirsiniz. Ama eğer ki bize soru sormak isterseniz, sevgili konuğumuza soru iletmek isterseniz bizi YouTube kanalımızdan takip edin lütfen ve oradaki chat kısmını kullanarak bize sorularınızı iletin. Ben de mümkün olduğunca sohbetin uygun yerlerinde ve vakit kalırsa da sonunda kendisine bu soruları aktarmaya çalışacağım. Bugün çok değerli bir isim bizlerle birlikte. Hem Harvard Business School'da hem Oxford'da profesörlük yapmış. Şu anda da Oxford'da aynı zamanda onursal profesör olarak da bir kürsüsü bulunan ve daha sonra da tüm bu birikimini Cultural Strategy Group çerçevesinde birleştirerek inovasyon konusunda ve inovasyonun kültür tarafındaki yansımaları ile ilgili birçok dünyadaki büyük şirkete danışmanlık vermekte olan çok değerli bir isim bizlerle. Douglas Holt bizlerle. Douglas, welcome to the program.
Lovely to be here.
Yeah, I spent a lot of good words for you for the introduction. You can be sure about that.
Thank you.
So let's kick off, Douglas, with an icebreaker, with a very broad question. How are you getting affected with the pandemic? How is it changing your life?
Well, it's we moved to England a year before the pandemic, so we were just sort of getting acclimated, and now we just sit in our house. But for me, it's fine. I spent the pandemic writing a book, so. It was, I did some consulting, but it also forced me to actually do more research than I usually do. So I wrote the article in HBR at the beginning of the pandemic, and then I took that straight into a book. So it was good.
Right, great. So when will the book hit the shelves?
It takes about a year. So probably next spring, 2000.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to hear that because the article is really amazing. I really like the angle that you bring to the culture and innovation notion. So this is why I would like to discuss it with you face to face or digitally, if I may say, this evening. So regarding this pandemic, Douglas, I know that's a very broad question, but what picture do you see when you look at the reaction of the companies to this pandemic? We have been talking so much about risk mitigation. We have been talking so much about supply chain disruption. But according to your point of view, what are some crucial points that affected the businesses throughout this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I have a contrarian view on that, as I do many things. You know, from a brand perspective and thinking about the opportunities that are created and the threats that are created. There's certainly businesses that are caught up in that, and some are obvious, and some stock prices have taken off as a result. But most of them aren't, and I think that the real risk is that companies, because they like to think of they want to be relevant. They want to be, on trend with what's happening. So every company is trying to figure out what's their kind of pandemic, post-pandemic angle. I mean, companies that I'm working with. And what I'm counseling them is, for you're selling coffee. There's not a big angle there. Don't worry about it. Focus on your business. So I think it's similar to I'm not sure in Turkey it's different, but in the U.S. we had this moment where brands, because of the way they operate, they've written about a lot. They struggle for cultural relevance, and so during the Trump administration, there was a onslaught of woke brands, that thought they needed to be political because that's what made them relevant. And the same point holds. There's some brands that sort of have the credibility and are in the right category to be political in particular ways. Most aren't, and most shouldn't be doing that. But nonetheless, it's sort of everybody jumps in, kind of one size fits all. And I think the pandemic is kind of the same thing. That there are some interesting things to think about in terms of consumer culture. I think, especially in terms of the reaction formation, like when after we come out of the pandemic, people are saying, well, we're going to, we're never going to work again, and the companies and et cetera. Maybe, maybe not. But from, the stuff that we have control over, that's more leisure, more discretionary, for that kind of stuff, what we see culturally, it's more usually dialectic. We miss all that stuff, and we actually are going to be valuing these rare things, these little, trips to the cafes, these things that we haven't done for a while. So that's kind of what the people in consumer culture are talking about. I think they're right, but so brands can jump into that. But it's a very, it's a more tactical sort of thing. I think you lose focus if you want to be the pandemic brand.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Regarding the cultural innovation model, Doug, when I first read the article, I have the luxury and privilege to pick any article from the book and translate it myself to Turkish. This is my very tiny privilege, being the editor-in-chief here. So I picked your article and translated it to Turkish, and I was really struck with one sentence in it. You were just saying that most of the businesses are trapped in the present. Even the most disruptive ones are not immune to that. So just that's really a very simple but very striking argument. Can you just dig down a little bit of this? What makes you think about that? What is the reason behind this?
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you picked that up. I was running with that strongly, and I didn't get as much positive feedback in English language editors. But I think the idea is, and it stems from kind of the critique of brand strategy across the board. And what I find, what I'm kind of hinting at there, though I wasn't able to sort of extend it, but I've done a lot of work in technology and for, startups too. And I find it as much in tech companies as I do as in big corporates. But the idea is that companies get caught up, the kind of paradigm of strategy, whether it's brand strategy or big, Michael Porter kind of strategy, they get caught up in thinking about the value proposition. We're competing. There's, so it's even more today than, when marketing kind of dominated strategy 20, 30 years ago. We talked about positioning and functional benefits and so, but now we talk about the value proposition. We break it down, and it's really driven by technology and engineering sort of logic in a lot of ways. And what that does is it makes a lot of sense if you're doing, selling medical technology in B2B or something, and it's very objective and very, hard functional benefits, and you can make something work better, cheaper, or so forth. But most categories, consumer categories, those constructs are cultural constructs. They're not these objective truths. And so, and they move over time. How we think of safety, how we think of something that tastes good, how we think of status, how we think of masculinity, whether they're identity constructs or whether they're like seemingly hard, tangible, functional benefits. They're all these cultural constructions that if you trace them over time or across contexts, they're very movable. And that's where the big opportunities, the big changes in markets are. And so what I'm trying to argue there is that the whole paradigm of brand strategy and just strategy, corporate strategy, is treating these concepts as objective, durable truths. So you get locked into the category. The category becomes, it's the eternal present, I call it. In your mind, it goes forever because that's all we know. We can't imagine it being different. And imagining it being different is actually how you innovate. So that's the trap.
I think this is as you have also mentioned, this is the main reason why in many industries we don't see a high pace of innovation. So lots of billions of dollars are spent to systems, to technology, to consulting, to programs, initiatives, but still the pace of innovation in some industries are really lagging behind the others. So is that the main reason behind this industry staying behind?
I don't know. I mean, some industries are innovative, some companies are, some aren't. But I think what you can say is, two things. One, if you look at, I look at the world kind of in a very simple way and look at tech companies and kind of the whole world of technology and innovation there, and then everybody else. And the everybody else, because they've been the big corporates, have been so poor at innovation, they're trying to copy the tech companies, which I make fun of a little bit in the article, because they've tried everything, they think, and you know, why not just pretend we're a tech company, even if you're Unilever? You know, it's kind of funny. They use all the same terms and have their little skunk works and their little you know, lean startup process and the whole bit. But I think, you know, what you can say is that there's in the non-tech categories, the incumbents systematically are kind of poor, kind of mediocre at innovation, regardless. You know, they spend a fortune on, and there's kind of a fads and fashion cycle of what is the, you know, what's the innovation sort of model of the day, and what the consultancies are trying to sell them and stuff. But they're just really, you know, you look over decades and they don't do very well, and so they keep getting, you know, the little under-resourced entrepreneurs take huge markets from them. So that's why I like the Blue Buffalo story in the case study in the article, because here's, you know, this tiny company with no business to have any market beating three of the biggest, most, you know, famous blue chip, you know, consumer marketing companies in the world that totally dominated the category, marketing, brand, science, everything, and they got demolished. And I think, you know, so you see that over and over again in different, you know, non-tech, quote unquote, categories. In tech, I find the same thing. We can talk about that a little if you want.
Sure.
You know, unicorns, the famous companies, again, B2B, it's not as big a problem, because you can really kind of solve it. They're usually technical problems, and you're solving for something, some problem in the value proposition. Works out, you know, works pretty well as a proxy for, you know, it isn't objective truth, but close enough. But when tech goes out into consumer markets, that's when you're in the world of brand and in the world of culture, and they run into the same problems, because they think same kind of problem. They think, well, the innovation is the, you know, we figured it out with the code. we solved it as an engineering problem. And we battle tested it through our lean innovation design thinking process. We've got product market fit, you know, and the product market fit is with, you know, early adopters who are like they're techie people, and they think of things in techie ways. And then they think, let's go to market, and they get these huge sums of money from the VCs, and they spend it on stuff that's actually detrimental to growing these businesses, because they really need to be building a brand and culture. They need to be convincing people culturally that it's an innovation, which is very different than convincing an engineer that technically it's something different. So in both spaces, you have these fundamental problems with innovation that have to do with not understanding kind of the brand, our cultural.
Right. That's really interesting story, the Blue Buffalo story that you have mentioned. I'll be asking a little bit of questions about that, but your answer to these phenomena, or the way out for getting stuck in the present, is the cultural innovation approach, the model, if I may say. So can you just tell us a little bit of what does this cultural innovation model stands for, and what are some main pillars of it?
Sure. And in the article, I should say, I can confuse things a little bringing in the tech piece, because it's really not in the article. And the article is really written about kind of non-tech consumer markets, because it works a little differently once you get into trying to map it onto a big tech innovation. So basically what you see over and over again, or what I find in my research over and over again, is that markets, categories, you know, mature, quote unquote, markets, consumer goods, services, over time, as companies compete around the value proposition of, you know, we're going to control this benefit, we're going to control, you know, be the price brand, etc. They all assume the same idea of the market. So they're all assuming that, you know, if it's whiskey, they're all assuming the same kind of ideal customer who wants the same smooth whiskey and same kind of benefit. So they're all, the kind of model that they're using is the same. And then the way in which they differentiate are these very trivial differences. So what happens in all these categories is a culture forms, a market culture. And so think of the category as a culture where all the companies, the media, the consumers are all kind of bought into a model of the way that culture works, whether it's automobiles, whiskey, dog food, you name your category. And so they all the category players start looking pretty much like each other. They're kind of variations on a theme. They're quite similar. And so that I call the category orthodoxy. So everybody buys into this ideology that the category, what makes a good car, what makes a good whiskey, what makes a good dog food, and gets reinforced over and over again. And so there's really no way out. So that's the eternal present. That's the present tense. Everybody's in the present tense. And what happens over time in any categories, because it's a cultural construct, these constructs they're not bolted to the center of the earth. They change historically when some kind of shock, some kind of contradiction, disruption happens. Then all of a sudden the idea starts making less sense. It becomes less valuable to consumers. The media starts questioning it. So it comes, I talk about an Achilles heel. It becomes, less, the equilibrium starts to recede. And that's the opportunity, is like which part of the category, which key construct in the category is coming undone, where there's an opportunity to reinvent the category. So instead of saying, let's compete on the value proposition, let's make our dog food more nutritious based on the way we all define nutrition in the category, let's take this whole idea of nutrition and rethink it in this whole different way. That's where the innovation comes from. And what happens is, as the category starts, I wouldn't say breaking down, but having these Achilles heels, showing that it's not a solid reality, you get these subcultures, I call them vanguards on the margin, that start challenging the culture. And usually they're around for a long time. You see these different subcultures, little movements, little, kind of unorthodox groups that are really not interesting from a business standpoint, could be for decades. But all of a sudden, they have the right ideology, the right alternative to be the new dominant culture, the new category culture. So what you find time and time again are the entrepreneurs. Sometimes they grow up in these subcultures who take it and go mass and say, okay, forget that idea of coffee, forget that idea of dog food, forget that idea of whiskey. Here's a different idea, different way of thinking the benefits, and challenge. They become the challenger brand, and they're not just challenging other brands, they're challenging the whole idea of the category. And so that's roughly the model that's playing out. Yeah,
that's really an interesting approach, Douglas, because for many businesses, value proposition is like a fixed target, so you can easily shoot it. The better your weapon is, you can shoot sharper, if I may say. But at the end of the day, the cultural innovation model is a moving target. So it's not staying at its place. It's changing by context, by time, by some disruptions. So how can a company integrate this model, if I may, or realize this model? What are some steps in order to realize the main idea of this cultural innovation model?
That's the big question. It's a question I've been trying to answer for 20 years.
The other is easy. I have this value proposition, I have these targets, I have these conventional wisdom. So let's do it better than the others.
Right. Yeah, and that's you touched on the reason why this model doesn't go away, despite it being pretty dysfunctional and pretty mediocre, is because of what you say. It's easy. And I get in this a little bit in the last book I wrote, Cultural Strategy, 10 years ago. I talk about the brand bureaucracy, but it's really, you think about big bureaucratic companies, they need a very simple kind of formulaic way of doing brands to, move around different managers. Senior managers have to approve things. So having that nice, simple one-page dashboard, here's the brand, here's how we manage it, here's the value proposition, that's very helpful. this approach is not easy.
Right.
And so you really have to, you know, there's the dedication that it takes to understand historical context of your brand and identify those opportunities and build, you know, concepts that can challenge the category. That's a whole different, it's a different paradigm, it's a different discipline. And I've been working on that for, again, you know, 20 years on and off. And I would say that it comes more naturally to people who aren't groomed in the kind of corporate brand, corporate strategy world, because it just really is kind of puzzling. It doesn't make much sense otherwise. But to answer your question directly, that's the book I'm working on is a direct answer to that, because before I've written more conceptually, more kind of academically about this, but it's very hard for people to take this idea, even as it's in this article, and think, oh, how do I apply it to my business, my company? And they end up getting trapped in exactly the conversation we had earlier about COVID. It's like, oh, I need to look at these big historical forces. They don't know quite where to look. And so it's COVID, it's climate change, it's just some generic force. And really, the training is you need to look at what is bearing down on your category, the constructs that matter in your business, not just generally in the world. But we can be here for 6 or 8 hours if I really answered your question properly.
I see. If you like, let's go over this Blue Buffalo example, if we may. Yeah. I really like this example in the article, and I also believe that it's a really a representative example of how a brand can challenge the most powerful incumbents and use this cultural innovation model. Can you just tell this story a little bit, how what the Blue Buffalo did and how they progressed throughout this, what steps they took throughout this challenge, if I may say?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And this is to preface it, as your audience may be very interested in developing new businesses in Turkey to take to Europe and so forth. And I think this model is most opportunity, big companies like to hire me, and I, happy to help them. But it's more of an entrepreneurial model, right? It's more of a challenger model. So for starting new businesses in Turkey that can, take on big companies in Europe and the West, it's certainly a good model. So Blue Buffalo. So the category is pet food, dog and cat, but dog food in particular in the U.S. And it's folks in the U.S. Simply because of how people feed their dogs, and their relation with dogs tends to be a little bit different than cats. But in the U.S., the category had always been controlled by Purina, which is owned by Nestle now for some number of years. I've done quite a bit of work with Procter & Gamble at the time, and Mars, huge company, candy and pet food, basically, privately owned, but global. And I think all these brands were very, very well represented in Europe as well, and I think in Turkey. And so they basically owned, other than the private label business, if you just look at the branded business, they're probably 70-80% of the business back at the start of this story. So it's completely dominated it. And you had this kind of tier system of different price points. So you had the kind of the historic brands that were kind of the big industrial brands like Purina, like we're big, mass-produced brands before. There was no dog food. It wasn't standardized. You buy it at some local shop, something. So they were like the McDonald's, the first brands. And Mars had its version of those. So that was kind of the base premium tier. And then they developed over time. To develop a tier above, they developed this sort of scientific tier, which was we're doing all this research and development into pet nutrition, and have the best scientists studying this and know the most, and we have this scientifically approved dog food using lots of language that's very wonky and scientific. and selling it through the veterinarians. So the vets are kind of giving their credential to the brand, and that was much more expensive. So it was that tier. So this is how the category operates. This is the kind of the present tense from the 70s onward, where you had big industrial companies saying, "Trust us because we're the big brands. We're Purina. We love your dog. We've got the best scientists, etc." And having this more kind of sciencey brands at the top of the pyramid. So I call it scientific industrial dog food. The Achilles heel starts to come out. So one thing that's interesting is pet food is directly connected to human food, right? Because we're projecting all the things we learn about and think about with human food and food culture onto our pets. The only difference is we don't taste the stuff. So instead of whereas human food, there's a lot of hedonic aspects to it, and aesthetic aspects. For dog food, it's predominantly nutrition. The dog has to seem like they enjoy it, but we're predominantly thinking about nutrition. So what happens is the disruption comes so in the US, we had the same scientific industrial food culture where the FDA was telling us, here's what healthy food is, and don't eat fat and do this. And that whole thing came apart, as I'm sure many people in Turkey know too. In the 80s, 90s, we had all these chronic disease and obesity and et cetera, all based on supposedly all this good science. And these food movements started challenging this, the ancestral diet and paleo, and that all kind of aggregated on the internet when that happened, late 2000s. And it's a huge challenge. We had this huge shift in human food culture that's just blowing up the idea that these big food companies are actually looking after our health. And that immediately started trickling down into pet food, into dog food. And people are saying, well, if I can't trust, Kraft and General Foods and General Mills, et cetera, for making food, and I have to actually look at the label and they're putting all this weird chemical stuff in my food, maybe that's happening to my pet food too. And so that's just kind of blew up in the same way. And there were a couple of crises where there was actually contaminated food that became, circulated on social media. And all of a sudden, what used to be a fringe, so there was always kind of the hippy dippy dog food, very expensive natural foods, dog food for years and years. And they just had a little share, but they were all about natural ingredients. And, you can read the label and it's, it is potatoes and it is lamb and there's not much else going on. Very different approach. Here's the food. Whereas these big brands, they're showing happy Fido and nice ads and trust our science, but don't read the label, because if you read the label, there's some funky stuff in there. And all of a sudden, so that's the Achilles heel, right? It's if you're trusting the big brands, it means the brand, the logo, the story. I don't want to read the label of everything in the grocery store, so it's just easy. Grab that bag and go home. Great. But all of a sudden, there's that little seed of doubt. And there was a bunch of these brands that could have taken advantage way before Blue Buffalo. They were happy. They hated the big grocery brand, so they didn't touch it. But this Blue Buffalo guy was an advertising guy, and he saw the opportunity to do this more challenger approach. So let's actually take that. They took exactly what these kind of natural foods, dog food brands, in terms of their formula and stuff, but he started this huge challenger advertising campaign, these terrible ads. They're like slice of life ads where he's, talking to people, you love your dog. Yeah, I love my dog. You ever looked at what you're feeding him? Look what's on. And he make that. Yeah, they're like, little vignettes of, documentary vignettes. And he said, well, and it's, chicken bone byproduct. And, they have had them read this stuff and it sounded just horrible. So ours has real, we use real chicken. And so they made like a stigma of these things, these like weird, chicken, the byproduct things, the meal. that, you know, probably aren't that bad, but they made them sound like these horrible processed industrial products. And they drove that into the store. So they had demos going on in the grocery store and just drove it on and on and on. And so it took about 5 or 6 or 7 years, but eventually they just institutionally, they shifted the whole category. Whereas if you're going to buy that stuff, you don't love your dog. You're just cheap because you're buying industrial crud. And if you're really buying good stuff, you're going to be buying things where you can actually know what the ingredients are. And so the package is different. So the package would show the ingredients, not the happy dog. They came up with these, you know, funny little like branded like life source bits where they put on the superfoods that we all humans eat. Your dog needs blueberries, of course, and you know, all this stuff. So they just played these very nice, you know, they worked with the food culture of the U.S. food culture,
right,
played with our worries about it, and built this brand. And they took the whole category. So that whole category, there are other brands that rode on their coattails,
yes,
but as Blue Buffalo ended up selling, the end of the story is they sold to I think General Mills for $8 billion, and P&G left the whole industry. They sold out their fancy Iams brand and everything else for $4 billion a couple of years before. So they beat the big.
I think that's really an inspiring story. What I have noted from this is also, Doug, it starts with understanding the dynamics of the category. It's like deconstructing the category, and you see what cultural things are going through. Then you define the Achilles heels, which is the weakest point for the incumbents or the big players in the industry, and how this paradigm shift is affecting them. And then you just show the consumer the real picture, or you just tear down the ivory tower, if I may say, and then you shift and you change the category. You just make it upside down. So I think these 4 steps are really good ways to realize this cultural innovation model. That's really interesting. The thing that I'm going to do just after this interview is going to go and check my cat's foods label to see what's going on. So, Doug, how about the counterattacks by the incumbents? Because they will not simply accept the challenge coming from the challenger brand. So they try to do something, but mostly it's not working. So why these counterattacks mostly fail from the incumbents?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and it was fun because I was in real time. I was doing work for Purina. So I wasn't working on the product that they wanted to challenge Blue Buffalo, called Beyond. I was working on other stuff, so I was kind of watching. And the reason is because they did not understand, though I was explaining to them as in real time, but they weren't able to institutionally course correct this idea of the category, the key constructs of the category, especially things like nutrition. Think your Purina or P&G, where you have all these scientists and you've developed this whole paradigm of this is what pet nutrition is, and we've got the best. We can show you based on our published papers, this is the best stuff. Say no. If you really think of the category culturally, and it has a dominant ideology, you have to understand what that is and where its weaknesses are, where its Achilles heels are. And if that ideology, and again, in pet food, it's really interesting because that ideology isn't just sitting in pet food, it's locked directly into human food. So the minute human food food ideology starts moving, you better be worried about this ideology. Right. So to think of your category and ideology, it sounds like some Marxist terms, but it's the same thing. It is it's an ideology that everybody who's participating at the big players are holding together. But at some point, you're not going to be able to, it doesn't matter how much money you spend. People are going to think, my pet's not going to be healthy eating your stuff because all this other media that I'm being exposed to, all this stuff I'm learning about my food. So the reason that they were unable to respond is that they didn't understand that Blue Buffalo was threatening the whole edifice of the category. They thought they're talking about this one ingredient, fresh chicken, let's say, instead of chicken meal, it's chicken. Okay, we'll just match them, and that'll wipe them out, because so they're thinking in this very kind of rational, more engineering way, like benefit, value proposition, right? Instead of there's an ideology. So first, the way cultural branding works, you buy into this whole belief system, and then, okay, I understand the meaning of that chicken versus that chicken meal. They're thinking, they're not seeing the big picture. They're just looking at the ingredients, thinking, if I change this ingredient, I'll be fine. What they didn't understand is their whole brand, because it stood for the scientific industrial food ideology, was tainted. The whole thing wasn't believable. Like people will look at that and say, oh, it's almost like a insecure thing. You're admitting your ideology is bad, that it's not good food, so you have to change the recipe.
Yeah.
So it's really at that kind of level where it's this kind of thinking of these features and benefits in this literal way. They're really symbols. Consumers don't think, they're not scientists, they're not engineers. We operate in culture and mythology. So they're not thinking that way. They're thinking of what does this stand for? What kind of company are you? What are you selling me? So they all got into those kind of traps where they spend a bunch of money, and they made some really good dog food, by the way. It wasn't like it was all smoke and mirrors. They actually, once they realized they were getting beat, they stepped up, but they didn't know how to act as brands did in that kind of natural food subculture. Because as I say in the paper, one of the other things that's important is the ideology has to pervade everything. So it's how you talk in an ad, what you put on your package. Everything has to be credible. And so they were making the right dog food, but then they give it to their ad agency and they'd make an ad as if it were the industrial one, like fun dog, and forget the dog food. And in that world, that's no. It's all about the ingredients, because you're not serious. If you're just trying to trick me by having a fun, playful ad, that's cheap dog food. And so they don't get these codes.
Yeah, I think that's a really striking example, and it's really a success story, if I may say. So we are approaching the end of our show, Doug. Last but not least, we have been seeing a huge rhetoric about a big transformation with this pandemic in terms of innovation, in terms of competition, and especially in terms of consumer behavior. What kind of a picture do you see for the upcoming future? Will we be seeing much more challenging companies like Blue Buffalo disrupting many categories, or things will go as they used to be before?
Yeah, again, I don't. We talked about the pandemic before. I don't think that has as much to do with it as the ability to use direct-to-consumer platforms on social media and in other places as well, that allow, in certain categories where the costs of entry, with the entry barriers are pretty low, those categories, I don't see I see the innovation will take over. I mean, you've probably followed what's happening in fashion, where it's become, Instagram fashion brands have taken over. We've had the first kind of flare out of the first direct-to-consumer brands, because they're playing not the brand game, but they're playing more of the tech game, performance marketing. They're just buying, putting Facebook ads out, and that doesn't work. But you can use the same platform and build and do the same kind of disruptive consumer brands through social media. So I think it's hard for autos, it's hard for certain categories, but there's a whole bunch of categories in which there's nothing that's going to hold these big incumbents in place unless they learn how to innovate better. So it'll be interesting.
Thank you very much, Doug. It's really a great conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing your book soon. So thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your insights. Really appreciate your time and effort.
Yeah, you're welcome. Can I give one last pitch? We're doing something in. My wife is Turkish, and so we've started a little social enterprise business in Turkey called Mumalan.com, and we're doing pro bono consulting for social enterprises, social entrepreneurs in Turkey.
That's great.
And using this model. So we're trying to help local companies who are doing interesting work for society and the environment using cultural innovation.
That's great, because I'm happy to see that the awareness and also the interest for those social impact companies in Turkey is also hiking up. So I'm really happy to see that, and I really appreciate your effort with that. Thank you very much, Douglas.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much. Enjoyed it.
Evet sevgili dostlar, değerli izleyiciler, bugün Douglas Holt'u ağırladık Fikir Önderleri'nde ve birazcık aslında markaların kültürel inovasyon modeli diye tabir ettiği ve şu anda bir kitaba dönüştürdüğü, yine bizde yayınlanmış bir makaleyle birlikte nasıl kategorisindeki en güçlü adayları bile, daha doğrusu en güçlü yerleşik şirketleri bile yerinden edebileceğine dair bir içgörü seti paylaştık. Umarım sizler için de keyifli ve ilham verici olmuştur. Bu akşam bizlerle birlikte olduğunuz ve bizi dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Hepinize sağlıklı ve iyi akşamlar diliyoruz efendim. Hoşça kalın.